Welcome to another episode of Live Coding with RabbitWerks JavaScript. Tonight is episode 3 of the Vue Basics series, where we're taking a closer look at some of the introductory phases of learning Vue.js and working with it as a framework. Tonight we're going to look at more Vue directives. Specifically, we're going to take a look at inputs, events and inputs using the vOn event handler and the vModel two-way data binding directive. So we're going to take a little bit of closer look at those two directives because they are pretty powerful. There's a lot going on in them, and we want to make sure that we can explain and know what's going on. So yeah, last week though, let me just pull up this really quick. Last week we were talking, where we left off, we were talking about vbind. Let me just pull up the preview version all the way down here. The dynamically bound data. So just a really quick refresher, because I know that we were having some issues with the internet last week, and so I was like kind of rushing through it at the end, so apologies about that. But so basically, just to refresh ourselves on vbind, it's basically how we can bind data and computed properties and whatnot to a Vue on our Vue instance, to HTML attributes and whatnot in our markup template. So we can pass anything into it as long as it evaluates out to a string, and Vue can read it as just a typical or just a valid HTML attribute. HTML attribute class for applying CSS classes and style for applying inline styles have special enhancements when using vbind with them. We can pass in arrays and objects and different combinations of values as long as they all evaluate out to strings at the end. So you can see right here, and for example, I have just a hard-coded string, class, computed property. We have a boolean here checking to see if the data property is set to isActive. So if that's true, it sets the class active on the div as well. And then we're also running through a ternary to check if the user is a mod. And if so, it's applying the mod class, and if not, it's just applying an empty string, which will basically default to null. So yeah, that's that in a nutshell. Specifically stuff like using a number of different classes in one object. We can combine them and build out a computed property, and sometimes we'll just call it, like if you say here, a class object. We can update the values inside of that object when the dependent data updates, and then everything will just be passed into the class attribute through the class object. So you can see right here, for example, we have vbind class, and then we have our active is active checker, moderator is mod checker, and then hard-coded text success class based on if the user is active or not. So you can see that having a bunch of stuff like this in our markup might be a little bit verbose. So you can see that breaking out something like this could be useful into a computer property where we don't have to have 4, 5, 6 different styles being computed and bound to our class. We can do it all in a computed property and pass that computed property into our class object or into our class attribute, and if Vue will take care of it behind the scenes and apply all the proper classes that we need. So we have this, and then what will happen when we extract it out to a class object is, you can see we're doing the shorthand vbind. We're binding the class attribute, and we're just passing in our class object. And right down here in our Vue instance, you can look and see computed, which has our class object in it, and it just returns an object with our classes in there. So the nice thing about this is that since it's computed, it caches the value, and the next thing that it will do is that it'll update based on any of the dependent data changes. It'll update the values in here and pass it along to our markup. So super helpful, especially for helping to keep things clean and tidy and whatnot. So check that out if you're looking for working with class objects and whatnot. And class object is just like a naming convention, just like an example. You can do whatever you want. So yeah. And then when we bind to the style attribute, it works in a very similar way. We just need to make sure, instead of applying just these CSS classes, that we're actually applying valid CSS property stylings. So instead of applying a class that will target a CSS rule, we're setting those styles in line, but dynamically. So they have to evaluate out to valid CSS inline stylings. And let's say hello to Matthew. He's in the chat and joining us tonight. He says first again, and that's awesome. Glad to see you're out. Glad to see you joined us again. Thank you so much for checking out the stream. And I hope your night is going well as well. Cool. And yeah, so basically what we're saying is that you can see user set flex is just a number 4. And we have our flex property. So if this was like a flex box something or other, we could set the flex amount just by this, because this will evaluate out to a valid CSS inline style. Same with the set user height. We can apply that height dynamically, that property value dynamically based on our Vue instance data, and it'll evaluate out to a valid CSS attribute or style inline. Cool. So that just a really quick refresher on vbind and the awesome power. If you want to take a look at this documentation, it is in the GitHub repo, which the link is in the description. You can go ahead and take a look at that if you want. So let's move on to this week now. So this week we're going to take a look at a couple of different directives. We're going to take a look at vOn, which is for handling events inside of Vue. And we're also going to take a look at vModel, which is handling two-way data binding inside of Vue. And then once we're done with that, depending on time, we'll go through our Lifecycle Hooks and what those are and what they mean for using inside of our Vue instance. And cool. So without further ado, thank you so much if you're tuning in for the first time. That's awesome. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to get all awesome stuff coding via RabbitWerks, and thanks for checking it out. All right, let's get started. So vOn, you can see right here it says Vue's built-in event handler, and then I have a link included in the description, or the markdown file, for a really good resource for handling events in Vue.js. So this directive is a full syntax, and it also has a shorthand syntax, so kind of like the vbind directive, where there's a full and a shorthand syntax. The full hand syntax is the v-on, v-on, and then we set a colon, and then we're gonna say the name of the event that we want to run, or listen for, and then inside of our argument body, we're gonna run some sort of code or do some sort of evaluation. And so if you look at the shorthand syntax, it is denoted actually just with an @ sign. So instead of doing v_on:event, we can just do @event, and then that'll evaluate out to the same exact thing as far as Vue is concerned. So v_on allows us to listen for DOM events on our Vue instance, which is super powerful. We can run inline evaluations or call a more complex method whenever that listen to event is fired. Vue behind the scenes proxies the event object from the DOM event that was fired via our directive, and we can access that proxied event object by passing $event. Now that's super important. We need to proxy it as $event because it's showing that it's a predefined variable by Vue or predefined object that we can access via Vue, and that's proxied from the actual event object that happens from the DOM event that gets triggered. So Vue gives us access to that super easily by passing in $event into the method that is being called. We can even access the $event object inline as well. So for example, we could say v_on change. We can set name.first equals event.target.value. So changing somebody's name on our data property or data instance and whatnot. So although we have access to the event object, it isn't necessarily required to use the directive. We can simply run a parameterless function if we want as well. So say we had an event that was just like a button that increased our counter. We can just run that function in there, and we don't necessarily need... Okay, so maybe we can demonstrate it. So we have this stuff right here that I will just comment out for now, but let's see. So let's give ourselves a button, and then inside that button we'll say +1, and let's also do text span in here, and we will just come back to that. We'll add a property to our data object inside of our Vue instance, and we can just call it counter, just like that, and it'll start off at 0, and that's fine, just like that. So now inside of our span, we can just display the value of counter via string interpolation, just like, not like that, sorry, counter. All right, okay, so now once we have that displaying properly, you can see it says 0 right here, and we just want to increase that value per click. So we can actually just say right here in line, we can say v_on:click, oops, and that's going to be equal to an inline evaluation. We can just say counter ++, just like that. So we can either extract this out to a method. We can say, methods down here. We'll say counter +1, and we can just say in here, we could say counter ++, just like that, or something, whatever. The point is that we're running a function or some sort of evaluation, and we don't need that Vue that event object in order to use this directive, but it is available to us in case we want it. So if I'm going to click this button, you'll see it'll increase our counter object. So just like that, and it's not passing in anything. We can even call the function in here instead of just doing it inline. We can do counter +1, just like that, and it'll run this .counter +1. Whoop. Counter is not defined. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not the right this. Okay, so this is correct, and then we just, inside of our method, since it is an object-oriented based class-based programming environment that we work with Vue, we have to make sure we remember that we are in the correct context. So this being referring to the Vue instance, got to make sure we have that on there. So with that on there, we should be able to get the same result now. So if we just click the button, you can see that it increases by 1 each time. Cool. So pretty simple example in that first part, but just kind of demonstrating some basic working arounds and whatnot. All right. So note, especially, so when we work with the when we work with the event object through Vue, we need to pass it into the event object as $event to get access to it. And the function, or we can call the parameter or whatever we want, i.e. $event can be passed in as E in our function, but it just needs to be passed in from our Vue instance as $event. So I think that's probably kind of confusing, but basically if we look back at our HTML, so I have this this button, other button that we created. Let me just uncomment it really quick so we can take a look. Oops. Okay. What the heck is going on? Come on. Alright, delete that, tab it out, fix it. Okay. So we have this button that it's listening for a click event on, and when it registers a click, it runs a function called runLog, and we pass in the first parameter is our $event object that gets proxied from Vue, and the second parameter we're passing in an argument of a name, a property on our data object. Not a big deal what it is, just an example. So you can see that basically if I run this, we get the mouse event. That's the event object, our first parameter, and we also get name. So, but if I'm to switch these around, we can see something. So it still proxies it, but it's saying that right now name is the $event. So my point in saying this is that the $event, this part right here, when we pass that into our function or run something in inline as an evaluation, we need to we can only access it via $event. So if I were to take this $sign off and even just take name out, so if I just pass event in just like that and get rid of these, get rid of that, console log, and run it, it's gonna say event is not defined on the instance because Vue proxies the event object as $event. So if I change that out simply like that and click it, you can see that we get our event object back. So it's very cool. Yeah, Vue is awesome. It really is super intuitive, and it does. I like the immense flexibility that you get with using it. You can do things in various different ways, and it's very unopinionated, which makes it really cool to work with because you can do stuff, you know, in different ways and outside the box type of programming and whatnot. Whereas with something like React, you're a little bit more stuck inside of this like rigid set of like designed or development standards where it has to be a certain way, otherwise it just doesn't work. So I think for that case it is a lot of fun, but at the same time it does leave questionability for people just starting out with Vue on what would be like the right way to do it. But there is not necessarily like a right way to do it. There's like best practices and stuff, but that's kind of the beauty of using Vue, is that there's not like a right and a wrong way. I mean, there is a wrong way, but most of the time it's not wrong. It's just like wrong versus JavaScript in that sense. So okay. Anyways, so I hope this is making sense. What I want to do really quick is just I think I'm gonna give this stuff a little bit of padding really quick. So I'm gonna come into main.css and just gonna come up here and target the app ID of app. That'll give us the div, and actually what I want to do is target all of the children directly descendant of it, and we're gonna say margin, that's gonna be 2 1 actually 1 rem on the top and bottom, and we can just set it 0 for side left and right because we're centering things. All right, cool. That'll give us some margin to work with. And actually let's bump this font size up just a little bit too. We can see things a little bit. Oh, you know what, it's because these are buttons. So I'm just gonna add in this and give ourselves a little bit of more larger font size to work with. All right, cool. You can see it a little bit better. All right, so what's some other cool stuff? Let's go back to the markdown file and see where we're at. So we talked about how we need to pass in the event object via Vue with $event to get access to it. And okay, so you might have noticed that the Vue directive is a bit more complex looking than the previous directives that we've looked at. And that's because there are a number of chainable enhancements that we can use, that we get to use with this directive to make working with events in Vue a breeze. So it's actually pretty simple to understand what's going on once you kind of break it down and just see it. Otherwise, I can know that looking at something like this can be a little bit daunting at first, but it's actually pretty simple. It's just basically chaining together different possibilities of what you can do and just really honing in exactly the event that you're looking to listen for. So yeah, and we're going to break it down a little bit now and take it piece by piece and look at each part of this directive and see what's going on. All right, so the first part is the directive. So v-on, it's the directive, it's required obviously to use it. We can either use it as the full syntax of v-on or denote it as a @ symbol for shorthand syntax. Alright, so this is the directive handler, the function caller that tells Vue we are listening for an event on an element in the Vue instance, right? Pretty straightforward. Second part of this directive is the DOM event. So in this case, we're listening for a key press, and it's also required we need to tell Vue what event we're listening for. So you can see that we can listen to any of the native DOM events that are normally available to us, just as we would. So you can see a couple of different examples. We have a v-on click, a double click, a mouse move, key down, an input event, a change event. There's a ton of different events. We can listen to all the events available to us, all the DOM events normally available to us in vanilla JavaScript in Vue as well. By the way, whenever we see a ... in between some sort of brackets and documentation, it usually just means quote unquote do something here, because it's not going to usually be a rest or spread operator inside of just brackets. But if that ever is confusing, you're not sure what that means, it just is kind of like a placeholder for doing something here, doing some logic, running some function kind of thing. So just so we're clear on that. Looks like Joseph has joined us in the chat. Hey dude, how's it going? I hope CJ's stream was good. I know that he was doing a Vue.js intro video for the one of the Denver meetup or something over there, so that's cool. Glad you made it over here as well. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're just checking out v-on directives right now. Alright, so the next part of this is the event modifier. Alright, so you can see it says prevent. The event modifier is in fact optional, and then so basically oftentimes when we're working with events we need to modify certain behavior certain default behaviors for events when they get fired. For instance, the submit event inherently reloads the browser page when that event gets fired. That's not the behavior we want in our application. And in vanilla JavaScript, we would call the event method event.preventDefault to stop the page from reloading to prevent its default behavior. And Vue event modifiers are built into the Vue directive and allow us to easily negate these behaviors, like calling their origin functions. So I've included a link about JavaScript DOM events. You can learn all about that stuff. It's the events chapter on the Eloquent JavaScript book. And if you haven't checked that book out, I highly recommend you read it, because it just really gives you a good sense of the whole JavaScript ecosystem and what's going on at a lower level. So highly recommend Eloquent JavaScript. Go ahead and check the link out. And we can take a look at all of the event modifiers that we get to use in Vue. So the first one we can see is our example one is prevent, and that's essentially equal to event.preventDefault in vanilla JavaScript, and it stops the behavior of the default behavior of the event being fired. And then the next one, if we look at it, it is stop. So dot stop, and that is essentially the same thing as event.stop propagation, and that prevents the event from bubbling up the DOM tree. So from the tag or element that the event listener is on, it'll bubble up to the top level HTML tag essentially throughout the DOM tree, and in doing so it could potentially trigger other click events or similar events on its way up. So to prevent that from happening, we can use the stop propagation method or .stop event modifier in our Vue directive. Alright, so the next one we're going to look at is capture, and capture is basically the opposite of stop propagation. So this sets the event listener mode to capture, and it starts, basically what that means is that whenever there's an event listened for through this event listener, it's going to start at the very top element, so the HTML alt tag, and it's going to work its way down through our DOM tree, and it's going to check and see if that event listener is on any of the elements it passed, and if it is, then it's going to run that event listener callback on that element. So until it gets to the original element that it started at. So it's hard to explain, but again, if you want to learn more about JavaScript DOM events, bubbling and capturing and all that stuff, take a look at the link just above the list here. Learn more about JavaScript DOM events, and it'll kind of break down what all that stuff means and the caveats of it and whatnot. So cool. All right, the next one is self.self. So this modifier will prevent the event from firing unless the $event.target is the exact element the directive was placed on. So self. So for example, imagine we had a button with onClick attached to it and an inner span of text inside that button. If we clicked on that button, if we clicked on the actual inner span of the text, the event won't fire. It'll only fire when the outer button tag is clicked. So it kind of like hones in on the event, makes sure it makes sure that the event target is in fact itself. So it's a nice little event modifier to use in certain cases. And then the final one we got is .once. So it sets the event specified to only be allowed to fire one time, and then the event listener gets destroyed by Vue. So if we only want to listen for an event once, we can use the .once modifier, and it'll only listen to that event one time. Once it's triggered, it'll remove the event listener and destroy it completely. So can be helpful in certain situations. Again, more so the edge cases and whatnot, but it is in there in case we ever need to use it, and it does help when we do need to use it. So alright, so those are event modifiers. Let's move to the next section. So the next section inside of the v-on directive is the the key modifier part. And so you can see that, like, for example, we have .shift. if we look at our example, it says v-on keypress.prevent.enter. So in this case, we're listening for the enter key modifier. And basically what a key modifier does is it'll basically limit and check what key is being pressed based on the value that we passed into it, as which one to listen to, which key code to listen to. And it will either do something or it will not fire the event. So it'll only fire the event once all of the conditions are met, essentially. So in our example above, we have the .enter key modifier, and so that will only fire the event when the enter key is being pressed. So it's kind of like the .self for click events and stuff like that, but it's for key events and whatnot. We might only want to we might only want the enter key to trigger a key press event instead of all of the keys. So Vue again makes it easy for it to listen in on a specific key and specifically the key code that key produces. Plus, if we ever need to add any that aren't included built in, we can easily do it by adjusting the global Vue config file by using this key code snippet right here. So if we have a vue.config file, we can do vue.config.keycodes and then set it to either a singular key code or an array of key codes, I believe. So, but usually we won't have to worry about that because Vue has a list of key modifiers that already come built in. So we'll take a look at those. I have a list here, and looks like we have enter, tab, delete, slash backspace. So the delete and the backspace will both be listened to. They'll both trigger it when we're using this. Technically, the key modifier is just .delete, but it will work with the backspace button as well. So then we have escape, space, up arrow key, down arrow key, left arrow key, and right arrow key. And then we also have some system modifier keys. So these are a little bit different. So this is like control, the shift button, the alt key, and then the meta key. So that would be like if you're on Windows, it would be like the Windows key. If you're on Mac, it'd be like the command key. And then I think other things is like a meta key or like a diamond or whatnot. So, and that's different than listening to just that actual key code, because it's like if you want to do control alt save or something, control alt s for an event or something like that, it's going to listen for the control system key modifier versus like having to target the key code itself. So it has those built in. And then a couple other ones. So when we're using, we also have mouse modifier event keys as well. So we can limit trigger to left mouse click, the middle mouse click button, and the right mouse click button. And then we also have our exact modifier. So this is kind of limiting the event to be only exactly what we want. So for example, if we're listening for a control S, again like a save hotkey kind of thing, the event will only be fired if control and S are being clicked. If we were to click control alt S during that, it won't fire it, because it's, even though control and S are being clicked, which are two requirements, it's not exact. It's not exactly that, because we're holding the alt button down too. So and it looks Joseph in the chat was asking if these things can be chained. So yeah, that leads us to the next part. All of this stuff can be changed pretty interchangeably as well. Usually the syntax will be general syntax will be the directive event we're listening to, and then we want to do the event modifiers. If we have multiple ones, we can do that, and then the key modifiers, or we can do multiple ones on that as well. So yeah, you can chain it, you can do different types of combinations, which makes the the V directive really powerful and really can kind of fine tune exactly what kind of event we want to listen for, and the conditions of that event to be fired and stuff. So yeah, good question. Thank you for asking. So yeah, we talked about the limiting. Full example, we can just take a look at. These are just some examples. When we click the button on this, it will say hello world from the button, because that's the tag name. And then the text field receives input and runs the search function when the value of the input with the value of the input as a parameter. So we're just searching through some data essentially or something. We're getting the event.target.value and passing it into the function down here. And that's running every time we get a key press event. So pretty simple. All right. And then last but not least, we have the fifth part of the directive, which is our function, our argument body. It's most of the time it's going to be required. There are a couple of exceptions, which we'll talk about. But basically, this is going to be the final part, can be thought of the callback as the callback of the directive, or the code that will run when the event listened for is fired. We can run single evaluation. We can run a single evaluation inline here, or we can bind to a method on our Vue instance and run that. So super cool. Again, we can pass in the $event object, or we can omit it. We don't need to use it. We can pass in multiple arguments to the function if the function allows it. We can pass in static and dynamic variables as arguments as well. In special cases, we can even omit the argument body altogether and just make use of the event modifiers. So in the case of the submit event type, we are not calling or running any logic, because we would be like in this code snippet right here. You can see that we're not running any logic or any type of function with this event, but we are just preventing it from reloading the page on submit. So this is helpful, since we're not this can be really helpful for kind of utilitarian purposes like that, because say we're listening to this listening for this event in another way to do something else, but we still want to take advantage of that prevent default behavior. We can just simply add this submit listener.prevent and leave it at that, and we'll be good to go, and our browser won't reload. So it's cool. Yeah. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. All the talked about events and modifiers can be more or less chained together in any way possible to achieve the exact event listener we want to use. So, in summary, the the on directive is super powerful, and it really gives Vue its another one of those things that really gives Vue its superpower, in my opinion. Alright, so we're gonna move on to the next one. The next big one we're gonna take a look at tonight is vModel. Before I do that, though, I am gonna take just a quick break and get some water, because I am very thirsty. So I will be back in just a few minutes, and don't go anywhere, because we're gonna learn all about vModel and then jump into Vue's Lifecycle Hooks and figure out what the heck is going on over there. Cool. Thank you so much for tuning into RabbitWerks live coding sessions, and I will be back momentarily. All right, and we are back. Thank you so much for your patience. Now that my thirst has been quenched, we can continue on with awesome Vue stuff. All right, so vModel. Now this is one of those directives that a lot of people say that reminds them a lot of Angular, and that would be because it is inspired from AngularJS. vModel is essentially Vue's directive for two-way data binding. Again, I have a link about, actually this is just straight to the Vue.js docs on how to handle form inputs and whatnot using vModel, because honestly it's probably the best documentation out there. It's really clear, whereas some of their other stuff can be a little bit overly complex and not very clear, I guess, if that makes sense. I don't know, go check it out. It's a pretty good read. It'll help you learn stuff about vModel if you don't understand it after this. So this is basically, we're going to take a look at the syntax. So we have an input, text input here, and we're just setting up vModel equals name.first. So you can imagine that on our Vue instance, we have a name property under data object, and inside the name object, we have a first, and we're just setting vModeling with that. So what does that mean? So this essentially means that not only can we bind values to our templates and attributes and whatnot, we can also update the bound value if the input element receives input from a user. So we bind the value to an input, and then if that input updates or changes, then it'll also change the data property as well. So kind of like a two-way street. The first way is binding the data to the input, and then the second way is updating the bound data when the input value updates. So you can see right here, this is where it gets its two-way data binding name from, outbound and inbound. Alright, so basically behind the scenes, Vue will handle what to do with different types of inputs, and you don't really have to worry about all that much when using it. But just a couple things to keep in mind when we'll take a look at that in a second here. But we're not limited to the types of inputs we can use either, and vModel works nicely with all of them. So you can see I have a list of the most common ones we'll probably use. So text, password, date, text area, checkbox, radio button, a select drop down, color picker, telephone, search, submit, and more. Basically any of the inputs that we can use in HTML, we can vModel with. When working with vModel, a hard-coded default value such as placeholder or selected attribute in our HTML template will be ignored and will render as a blank value. So to properly select our default value in Vue, you need to set the default value in our placeholder selected attribute exactly to match the initial value of our data object that we are vModeling. So basically, if that doesn't make sense, Vue will always treat the Vue instance data as the source of truth, meaning that we should declare the initial value via our data object. Otherwise, if we try to declare it in our template, it will just ignore it, and it'll load in a blank response or a blank input, because it won't have anything in the data object that it's modeling to that matches the value that's inside of there. So it's just going to default to an empty input until we type something in. We could take a look at that example in just a second here. So we can take a look at a few of the more common inputs we'll vModel with, and just for an example of what they listen to and the prop that they're listening for to change, for updating and vModeling with. So let's see, the text input, it's listening for the value in an input event. Text area, same thing, it's watching the value property and listening for an input event. So the two main ones that we have to keep in mind for when we're doing this is the checkbox and the radio button, because those both listen or watch the checked property, and they're also listening for a change event as well. And then the final thing to keep in mind is the select options. The select dropdown, it's basically listening, or it's watching the value, and it is listening for a change event as well. And a rough rule of thumb is that we can assume that Vue will always listen to either the import or the change event for the rest of the inputs that we can model with as well. And it's going to be listening for the value as a property it's watching as well to get the value from. So, okay, let's take a look at some of this stuff really quick. So, let's come back here really quick and... So if I don't have anything in this tell here like that, I can just say 0. Or actually, let's see. Let's switch this. Instead of tell, we're going to do an input. Oh yeah, this is off topic, not off topic, but back on the V-on really quick, you can see right here this image. I just wanted to demonstrate we're listening for a mouse move event, and then we're accessing the event, and we're logging the client X and the client Y, so the mouse position. And you can see that in demonstration down here when I go to the console, and you can see that it's just logging in. So it shows that we basically have full access to the event object just as easily as we would when using it in vanilla JavaScript. So side note on that. All right, back to the inputs though. So we have, let's see, let's put an input of geez, text. We can delete the name and the ID, we don't need that, but we will vmodel it. So vmodel equals name. If we try to sit here, okay, so I can delete name out of this and just have it be an empty string for now. And you can see that if I try to set like a placeholder or something, it's not gonna do anything. Oh, it does. I'm sorry, not placeholder. Let's see if I set it to value. So, okay, yeah, so the value, you can see that if this was just a regular input and we set the value to hello world, it would set it as that, but because we're vmodeling with it, it's just defaulting to that. So I guess if you want to say that we take a look at our Vue instance, the dev tools, sorry. And we scroll down here, we can see the name, and then when we type stuff in, it updates it automatically. Cool, so basic Vue stuff. So let me see if we can demonstrate that with a select. So we'll do select drop down. We don't need the name or the ID, but we will vmodel with it in just a second. But inside the select, we need a couple of options, tags. So this is actually kind of interesting. So when we're working with the select drop-down stuff, we can actually dynamically generate the options by using our v-for directive. So if I want to set this and just say like, I don't know, we'll do an array of colors. All right, so an array. First one is black, second one will be red, and the third one will be green, just like that. And the last one we will have be yellow, just like that. Okay, so we have an array of 4 colors, right? And we want to set those colors to be able, we want to be able to build this select object or select drop down and be able to pick which color we want, right? So we'll have a selected color, just like that. And first, for right now, we're going to set it as an empty string, because I'll show you what I was talking about in a second with the default values and when we get this set up. So instead of our option, we can write v-for, and then we will just loop through color in colors, just like that. And then we can just say color. right? Cool. So we have all this stuff in here, right? And if we set the vModel now on our select attribute or select tag, selected color. All right, so this is what I was talking about. Okay, so you can see that we still have our options in there, but it's just rendering as a blank selection right now, and we wouldn't be able to set like a selected property. So even if we had hard-coded options in here like this, so red, green, blue. So if we were trying to set it like this and say we wanted red to be selected, it wouldn't work. It's not going to load it in there. You can see that it just kind of ignores it. But we still have all three options. And so in order to set up the initial value, like I was saying before, instead of using the selected attribute, let's just go back to our color. Whoops. Go back to that, and then what we'll do is set the value of selected color initially as the color we want selected. So oh, I'm sorry, with the option tag we do need the value attribute inside of it to give it a value of what it means, otherwise it's just an empty option essentially. So red, and let's just copy this in. Green and not capital green, just regular green and blue. All right, so we have values in there now. So we need to get this to populate, right? We need to get this input to populate with the default value. Right now it's just set as a blank string, and we can't use the selected attribute, so we just need to set the initial value in our data property, right? Like it was saying. So if we set it to red, and boom, just like that, you can see that it loads it in there. We could set it to green if we wanted, and just like that, it loads it in there. So cool. Okay, so let's get rid of these now. Let me get rid of all that. So I just have the one option again. Keeps doing that. Whoops. And we will say v4 equals color in colors, and then in here we can say color, and then for our value we'll do it after the v4. What was it? Color. Let me see. Okay, so yeah. So we get, okay, so yeah, so v4, we're looping through our colors array. We're setting each option as in its own color. We're setting the value or the display of that as the color name, and then we're also binding to the value of this option and setting it to each color that we get access to right here. And then you can see as we update it down here, it updates automatically. So a little bit tricky when we're working with select and vModel. I know it took me a little bit to wrap my head around it and like how to get things to work properly, but if we just kind of like look at it going about it this way, then you shouldn't have much problem at all. Cool. Let's see, where are we at? So So just, yeah, really quick, I just want to demonstrate that we can even do it with like something like a color picker. So this thing right here is color picker. You can see the color is bound to our color right here. And then if we go up to right here, let me space this out just a little bit. So input type equals color, and then we're v-modeling with the color property. So we have the default value set up right there like we would normally, and we can also click this and say we want to set it to like a nice Vue green or something like that. That's kind of close, and then hit OK. Let's take a look at it, and you can see it updates our color. Let's just do it one more time so we can see it. Watch down there, and it updates dynamically. So cool. It kind of shows that we can use it on all different types of inputs without any issue whatsoever. So lots of fun, lots of fun. Okay. Neat, and that's just the event object that Vue proxies for us. Okay, cool. Let's head back over to the markdown file and see where we are at. All right, scrolling down. So there's like a Vue modifier or a V model modifier that we can use that works similarly to the modifiers that we have available to us on Vue. One of them is .lazy. And that basically just forces Vue to listen for the change event versus the input event. It means it'll only update the data property once the user input has ended. So it can be useful for like if you're setting something based on the value, like running something automatically after an input, like hitting a server with user credentials or something. Obviously, if you're typing in a password and a username, you don't want it to send off that request every single character that we type. We want to make sure that we finish typing before it tries to process that and make any sort of call with it. So that's basically what the lazy modifier does for vModel. It waits and listens to the change event versus the input event, which means that it'll wait until the data and it'll only update once the user input has ended, kind of thing. So cool. Yeah, so that's pretty much vModel in a nutshell. It's a lot of fun, a lot of cool stuff you can do with vModel, so I encourage you to play around with it, build an entire quick little forum and stuff, and just save all of that data to your Vue instance. Just play around with it, see what you can do, see all the different types of like creations you can come up with modeling with different inputs and whatnot, and see all the different possibilities that you can do. It is a lot of fun to use. So all right, cool. So that is that, and then so the last thing we're going to look at tonight is Vue.js's Lifecycle Hooks. So what the heck is a lifecycle hook? Lifecycle hooks are predefined methods that don't have any functionality to them per se. They're essentially functions that we can hook into at various points throughout the Vue instance lifecycle. So I have a couple different links here. One is the hooks guide for the Vue.js docs, and then also the hooks API reference, which will give you a little bit more technical detail on what it's doing behind the scenes and whatnot. So you can take a look at both of those, and it'll give you kind of an idea of what is going on and where they're at. And it also gives this awesome lifecycle hooks diagram that we will take a look at right now. Okay, so you can see the lifecycle hook. Okay, so let's break this down. Basically just a flow chart of sorts. So at the top here we say new Vue, and it's initializing our new Vue instance. So basically right at this point right here. All right, cool. So it initializes the events in the lifecycle, and then it calls before create at this point. So before create we can hook into, and then once that's called, it initializes the dependency injections and reactivity injections. So basically populates and turns our data object and all that on all our methods and whatnot into reactive Vue injectable code that we use. It basically turns it into our Vue instance and makes everything reactive. Once that happens, it calls created, right? And then once it calls created, it goes into a check. So it checks to see if it has L option. If not, it'll go, and when VM mount element is called, it'll call, what does that say? So if it has the L option, oh, okay. So I'm sorry. So when it has the element option, when we're using Vue as a plugin like this, it'll just call it'll basically mount that instance to the element that we're targeting. So right here, if it has this, then we're going to search through it and try and find what element it's targeting, and then it's going to mount it to it, right? We're just going to target it for mounting. So basically this is just checking if it's going to be a plugin or if we're using it as a template option in our Vue instance. So if this was like a single file component, then we would be using the template option in this case. So we don't need to worry about this too much. It's just behind the scenes checking how it needs to render it and whatnot and compile. So basically right here, you can see, so if it's yes, it'll compile template into a render function. And if we don't have that template option, we will just compile the L's outer HTML as a template. And then once all that is finished, it's going to call before mounted. Oops. And that's right before it will mount the Vue instance to the actual DOM. So then it creates the VML and replaces the element we targeted with that Vue instance. And then once that happens, it calls mounted. Cool. So mounted is a good one, and that basically says that our instance is mounted to the DOM. And so this is when it goes into our mounted cycle, so to speak. And whenever we're listening for whenever our application is running in this, geez, that was annoying. Whenever our Vue instance updates its data, it's gonna listen for it here, and it's gonna run before update lifecycle hook, and then it'll re-render the virtual DOM, and then it'll patch the real DOM, and then it'll call the updated lifecycle hook method. And then once it's all done, once we're not using the component anymore, when it's gonna be torn down and destroyed, it's before that happens, it calls before destroy. So right before it gets destroyed, it calls that. And then once that's called, Vue will tear down the watchers, any child components, and any event listeners that are sitting on that Vue instance, and then it'll completely destroy the Vue instance. And when that happens, it'll call destroyed. So from start to finish, that's basically the life cycle of a Vue component. And we can take a little bit closer look at this as well. So lifecycle hooks, blah blah blah. These functions don't have any logic on their own. They're essentially just empty functions. They give us a place to run code or run functions, make requests, and more at certain points of the lifecycle. And then there are lifecycle hooks throughout the entire lifecycle of the Vue instance. So you can see a list of them that we have and when they get called. So let's take a look at what this does. So we can target our lifecycle hooks simply by typing them in as a top level element object on our Vue instance. So you can see, like, for instance, after this methods object, say I wanted to hook into the created method, right? So instead of doing any type of like lifecycle hooks object or anything like that, we can simply just type out and call our hook into the function, the lifecycle hook, right here on our Vue instance by simply typing in the name of the lifecycle hook and calling it, or setting up a function as it, like that. So we have this created function here, and that's just going to run, and it'll say console.log Vue instance has been created, right? And then, so we can do the same thing for, we can do this for all of them, to be honest, but we'll just look at some of the main ones. So mounted. And this is a little bit different since we're using Vue as a plugin. It's not gonna necessarily be able to see us running through all of the lifecycle hooks when we're doing it this way versus like loading in a component into our application and then completely destroying it out of the application through a full project or whatnot. It's a little bit easier to see it through that, which we'll talk about in a later stream. But for right now, this is going to just kind of give us an example of what is going on. So a good way to think about a lifecycle hook is if you've ever worked with like images in vanilla JavaScript, and there is a function that we can hook into essentially when we're loading images. It's the onload function. So if you've ever seen something like image.onload equals a function that we can do something with, blah blah blah, just like that. And if we were to say do some code here, so this onload, it's not it's essentially a hook, a lifecycle hook for the image lifecycle. So when the image finishes loading, it calls this method, but it doesn't necessarily do anything. It's just kind of a spot to say that we can hook into once the image is loaded, and then we can do whatever we want. So if once we can run the code that is dependent on the image being fully loaded in here. So it's a point in time that we can hook into after a certain event or series of events happens, and we can run some code in that point. So that's a good example of like a lifecycle hook for something that's not necessarily Vue. So I hope that kind of helps draw some comparisons for you a little bit. And then, so let's just create the before destroyed one, just like that. And we can say console.log destroyed, just like that. Okay, cool. So we should already have this stuff set up. If we pull up our HTML, you can see that it is in fact created and mounted right away on load, because we're just loading it into the DOM right away. So it calls created and then it calls mounted. And then if we were to say something like, if we set v on or vif on this and we remove it from the DOM, we'll be able to see it target the destroyed lifecycle hook. So vif 0, hopefully, maybe. It's probably gonna, oh, here, let's see. Actually, I don't know if we're gonna be able to do it with this on this, because it's the root of our Vue instance. So if we remove it from the DOM and destroy it completely, then I don't think it'll work like that. But you just have to take my word for it, I guess. When we get a little bit further along in this series, when we move into full form applications in Vue.js with like using the Vue CLI, then we can demonstrate the hooks a little bit easier, all of the hooks. So there's a couple of things I just wanted to mention really quick, is that with the lifecycle hooks, there's a special keep alive wrapper component for keeping different Vue components alive, and instead of completely creating and destroying them each time. And in conjunction with using the keep alive tag, we also get a couple of different lifecycle hooks that we can hook into in place of created and destroyed, which is deactivated and activated. So we probably won't need to worry about that for right now. Keep alive is kind of like an edge case thing to keep different components keep their state intact even if they're removed from the DOM and reapplied and whatnot. So we won't have to worry about it too much tonight or for a while, but when we get to it, we'll explain it pretty well. All right, so I think that'll do it for this evening. That's all I wanted to talk about. We're doing a little bit better on time. I just wanted to touch base really quick on some tools for if you're using VS Code and Vue.js. Excuse me. There's a plugin called Vue Tour, and it's by Pinewu, and it's just like Vue tooling for Vue.js. You get syntax highlighting, snippets, emit, linting and error checking, formatting, and debugging, all that stuff. So I would definitely recommend checking out this extension, downloading it, and getting that running. As well as the Vue 2 snippets from HoloTree. That's something that I use quite frequently, and it's just a set of snippets for look at all this stuff. There's tons of different stuff. So if anything, you can just use it as a reference for all the different syntaxes available to us when we're using Vue. So I would highly recommend using that as well, because it'll really give you a feel for what year's all available. And yeah, so I think that is going to be it on tonight's session. So hopefully you learned some good stuff. Thank you so much again for everybody that tuned in to tonight's episode. I really appreciate the comments in the chat and whatnot. And so what I'll do is I will push this to GitHub. I will finish up the README and push that to GitHub as well. You can go and take a look at it, and it will be ready and available for anybody who wants to take a look at it. So cool. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Live Coding with RabbitWerks JavaScript. Make sure to check out the RabbitWerks Code Beats playlist on Spotify if you want to get the code jams going on the off session. Link is in the description. If you want to get more involved with the community, you can join the Discord. Link is also in the description. As we mentioned before in previous streams, devlife.com, DVLFE.com, where it's developer clothing ran by my buddy Craig via Instagram and whatnot. He has graciously offered up a 25% discount now for any type of developer clothing when you use the checkout or the coupon code RabbitWerks. So 25% off is definitely a little bit nicer of a coupon, so definitely worth checking out. Go ahead and check out his products, and if you feel like getting something, make sure to use RabbitWerks all caps, and you get 25% off your next order. And I'm sure he would really appreciate it, because it's a new thing he's starting up and he's looking for all the support he can get, so I'm happy to help. I don't get kickbacks from it or anything. I'm just happy to promote and happy to pass on awesome deals to you guys for being such a cool community. So without anything else, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to RabbitWerks JavaScript. Hit the little bell if you want notifications for every time I go live, and we will see you next week on episode 4 of Vue Basics, where we'll dive a little bit further into what's going on with Vue, even more so than what we've done tonight. And we'll probably take a look at starting to scaffold out projects with the Vue CLI and instead of just using it as a plugin. Because right now this is like if we were to have a cupcake, but when we use Vue CLI to build projects and work through and write code like that, then it's kind of like a giant double-sized sheet cake, triple layered with extra frosting, fudge, nuts, whipped cream, all that good stuff. Sugar coma. So basically the point is that Vue CLI, Vue scaffolded projects is going to be a heck of a lot more powerful than what we've been doing here. So I can't wait to get started on that, and I hope to see you there with us next week when we get started. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Live Coding with RabbitWerks JavaScript, and until next week, wherever the sun, moon, stars, or whatever else airplanes in the sky are in your time zone, have a wonderful, awesome afternoon, evening, morning, noon, middle of the night, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Stay awesome and keep coding.